Lord Peter Deathbredden Whimsy, not 2 months returned from a tedious committee on ecclesiastical architecture, motored down to the Kentish coast in search of idleness, sea air, and, if Providence were kind, the brand of anchovy toast he remembered from childhood. His Daimler, gleaming like a polished aphorism in the autumn sunlight, nosed into the cobbled forecourt of Jettison House, ancestral seat of the late Admiral Sir Oswald Jettison, recently let, with sad but practical propriety, to a retired tea merchant named Armitage. It was 4:30, the precise hour at which English civilization must either submit to tea or confess itself bankrupt of decorum. Thus Whimsy, presented by the butler, one of those grand sepulchral specimens whose lapels seem eternally dusted with imaginary snuff, found himself ushered into a drawing-room so vigorously chintzed that even the antimacassars appeared to wince. Here, Mr. Arthur Armitage, pink-faced, round-spectacled, smelling faintly of bergamot and commercial triumph, presided over a silver service of formidable brilliance. At his elbow perched Miss Agnes Jettison, the Admiral's spinster daughter, who now occupied an upstairs suite as tenant-in-residence, her slender hands folded with the resignation of a lady who has outlived both fortune and fashionable bustle. Conversation hovered, respectably dull upon the village feet, the price of Indian leaf, and whether the new vicar's sermons showed too Protestant a briskness. But civility received a small concussion when Mrs. Armitage, plump, beringed, and bustling, lifted the lid of the sugar bowl and uttered a faint cry. Nestled beside the demure sugar cubes was a solitary teaspoon, its bowl intact, yet its neck curiously twisted. No violent contortion, merely a subtle, almost apologetic curve, as though the spoon had attempted a shrug and found itself made of silver instead of shoulders. Now who, breathed Mrs. Armitage, could have bent that? It was perfectly straight this morning. Miss Jettison gave a little shiver. Really, Mamma, it looks horribly like that business with the spiritualists. Table-turning and all that. The planchette of the parlor, you know. They do say this house is haunted. Whimsy's monocle flashed like a merry heliograph. Delightful. I collect hauntings as other men collect postage stamps, but allow me a look. He accepted the spoon between thumb and forefinger, scrutinizing its lean curve with lordly gravity. Interesting, he murmured. A bend of about 12 degrees, neither forced nor accidental. Not heat-warped, mind you, no bluish oxidation, a deliberate pressure of human thumb almost certainly applied while the silver was cooled. But why here and not at, say, the pudding course? Mr. Armitage gave a nervous cough. Careless maid, I dare say. Indeed, said Whimsy, yet maids are seldom careless at precisely 12 degrees. They lean, snap, or straighten. They do not compose gentle parabolas. One might infer intentionality. He replaced the spoon, wiping an invisible smudge from his lapel. Tell me, Miss Jettison, did your father favor eccentric cutlery? My father favored the Navy List and a tot of rum, replied Miss Jettison tartly. Neither requires teaspoons. Whimsy's rejoinder was forestalled by a thunderous rap at the drawing-room door. The butler materialized, mortuary pale. Beg pardon, madam. Inspector Paget is below, with Constable Tyler. There has been, an occurrence. The inspector asks if Lord Peter Whimsy would oblige him. An occurrence, Mrs. Armitage echoed, her rings chiming on the teapot. I fear, said the butler, the vicar is dead. A hush, so sudden it seemed to coat the room with frost, settled over the chintz. Whimsy removed his monocle, polished it with contemplative leisure, and replaced it. Do they ordinarily advertise such events to the tea-table? He asked. One may die at inconvenient hours, but so rarely within calling distance of the scones. The butler, immune to levity, intoned, Found in the vestry, my lord, locked from within. By all accounts, a shocking sight. Locked rooms, Whimsy mused, rising. A vulgar flourish, though occasionally instructive. Very well. Let us inspect the late spiritual estate of the Reverend Horace Palethorpe. But first, he paused at the sideboard, selected the distorted teaspoon, and slipped it into his pocket with an absent grace that was, to Miss Jettison, more chilling than any ghost. "Good heavens, Lord Peter," she whispered. "You can't think." "I think," said Wimsey pleasantly, "that a slightly bent teaspoon is like a badly quoted Horace. None but a pedant notices, yet the pedant cannot let it pass. And I, Miss Jettison, am a pedant licensed by His Majesty's University of Oxford, and the wholly less reputable one of curiosity. Come along." Outside, the October twilight had descended with theatrical punctuality, painting Jettison village in sinister lilacs and funeral greys. The square-towered church, St. Crispin's in the Marsh, loomed beyond iron railings slick with salt spray from the estuary. Lanterns bobbed like uneasy will-o'-the-wisps as Inspector Paget's men moved between porch and vestry, their boots crunching on damp gravel. Paget, a dour figure in Sergeant Major moustache and sensible mackintosh, greeted Wimsey with the ambiguous respect due to a titled amateur. "Sorry to spoil your tea, my lord. Reverend Palethorpe appears to have gone." "People will when unobserved," said Wimsey. "Describe the spectacle." "Best you see for yourself." Paget produced a key. "Door was bolted on the inside. We forced it." The vestry, starkly lit by an acetylene lamp, smelled of mouldering hymn books and wintergreen liniment. Reverend Palethorpe lay in a posture more suggestive of collapse than struggle, slumped at the writing table, face turned aside, one pale hand outstretched as though begging the brass cross for explanation. Near his fingers lay an up-ended ink bottle bleeding leisurely across a ledger of marriages. No wound was visible save a faint bruise at the temple. On the carpet lay a pocket watch, its glass spider-webbed. "You observe," Paget said, "no sign of break-in. Windows latched, door bolted, and yet the man is quite dead. Doctor puts it at between 3:40 and 4. "Time," murmured Wimsey, stooping. "It dogs us all, but seldom so punctually." He righted the pocket watch, noting the stopped hands. 3:47, a kind of courtesy, perhaps, dying in step with one's watch. He peered at the inkblot. Unfortunate for the couple scheduled next Easter. Gently he lifted a corner of the marriage register, then sniffed. Carbolic soap, Bishop's purple ink, and, why, Inspector, does the room smell faintly of Earl Grey? Paget sniffed too. "Tea leaves in the waste bin." He gestured. Indeed, a crumpled sachet of fine grey paper protruded, bearing the embossed crest of Armitage and Son, a plump mandarin clutching a tea leaf like a diplomatic dispatch. Wimsey straightened, eyes narrowing with almost feline amusement. A private brew for the Reverend? Or an ecumenical gift from the neighbours? Paget shrugged. Palethorpe was partial to a cup during sermon writing. Heart wasn't strong, by all accounts. "Yet faint hearts," said Wimsey, "rarely contrive locked doors." He stepped across to the priest-hole-like safe set into the vestry wall, open, papers undisturbed. "Inspector, may I borrow your torch?" While Paget obliged, Constable Tyler coughed discreetly. "Beg pardon, sir, but we found this just now in the churchyard path." He produced a silver teaspoon, the twin of its twisted cousin, unbent, immaculate, gleaming coldly under the lamp. Wimsey took it, balanced it on one finger as if testing moral equilibrium, and smiled very slightly. "Inspector," he said, "I believe our Reverend has been served his last cup with remarkable ceremony. 2 spoons, one straight, one sinuous, a locked room, and the aroma of bergamot where only incense should linger. A neat paradox for your docket." Paget sighed. "Always paradoxes with you. Any idea what it means?" "An idea? Heavens, no. Ideas are premature, like champagne before luncheon. Observations, however, are nutritious." He turned to the door, already unfastening his gloves. "Let me indulge a few. Have the kindness, Inspector, to preserve everything precisely where it lies, including the smell of tea. I shall return after 11's tomorrow, when the light is less theatrical and the churchwarden's memory less susceptible to melodrama." And with a courteous nod, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped back into the damp gloaming, the bent teaspoon resting in his waistcoat pocket like an unanswered riddle. Lord Peter found Bunter waiting by the church lych gate, hat and coat held with valentine precision against the hang of the evening mist. Without a word, the man fell into step as naturally as though the damp gravel path were a parquet floor at Bellamy's. When they reached the Daimler, Wimsey paused to tap a thoughtful finger upon the bonnet. "Bunter," he said, "we have acquired 2 spoons, one twisted, one straight, and a rector who preferred his tea laced with secrecy. Do make a memorandum, 12-degree bend, Earl Grey aroma, vestry bolted at 3:47. And, detain those details from the newspapers for the moment. Journalists become so embarrassingly romantic at the hint of poisons and pews." "Very good, my lord." Bunter opened the door, then hesitated. "If I may observe, the Reverend's shoes were crusted with granular residue, not churchyard clay, more suggestive of the sea-wall." "Excellent eye. The tide table for today, if you please. Low water at 3:20, I think. Our parson might have been strolling the shingle, meaning his return would coincide rather neatly with the brewing of a 4 o'clock cup." Wimsey slid inside. "Let us hunt supper before hunting spectres." The dining room at Jettison House, managed by the combined efforts of gilt candelabra and Mrs. Armitage's determination to appear festive despite the news from the vestry. The tea merchant carved a melancholy partridge, while Miss Jettison toyed with water biscuits, her blue gaze fixed on Wimsey as though he alone might repair the universe's faulty alignment. Conversation flitted, moth-like, around the lamp, but never quite alighted upon the corpse. Presently, Wimsey set down his glass. "I gather, Mr. Armitage, that Reverend Palathorpe was here yesterday." "For 11's," Armitage admitted, pushing his spectacles higher. He walked over to taste a new Darjeeling blend, terribly particular, the clergy. And he left, 12:15. Said he must prepare Sunday's harvest sermon. Wimsey inclined his head. "You keep excellent track." "My clerk had the time in his tasting book." Armitage attempted a smile. "Merchants are slaves to precision, Lord Peter. As are murderers, now and then." The quip fell in the room like a brittle ornament. Wimsey turned to the parlour-maid, Lucy, all freckles and starched collar, who hovered with the decanter. "When you laid tea today, at what hour precisely did you remove the silver from the pantry safe?" Lucy coloured painfully. "At 3:30, my lord. I looked at the long case in the hall, 3:30 exactly, because the Admiral's clock always strikes." "And you noticed nothing amiss?" "No, sir, except the spoon, but that was after." She glanced at Mrs. Armitage, who gave a tremulous nod. "Thank you." Wimsey accepted dessert, though he seemed to weigh every syllable rather than every mouthful. Afterward, in the library, Bunter produced the tide tables and an umbrella he had quietly retrieved from the vestry stand. Plain black silk, ferrule fretted by salt crystals. "Proof, if any were lacking," Wimsey murmured, "that the Good Shepherd inspected his flock of sand martins before sermon. Why stroll the sea-wall on a damp afternoon unless summoned, or unless meeting someone discreetly clear of parish eyes?" Bunter poured a modest whiskey. "Summoned perhaps by a note in his Morning Post." "Yes, and something in that note drove him to request tea for fortification." Wimsey sipped. "Tomorrow we pluck the parish at dawn." Dawn arrived pearl grey and smelling of kelp. Wimsey, cane in hand, traversed the 7 minutes from vicarage to church at a brisk clip, verifying the verger's claim that Palathorpe could not have slipped back unseen between matins and luncheon. Old Hodges, the verger, broom like a battlemented staff, described an argument overheard the previous day, A raised voice in the vestry, a man's sharper reply, door slammed at precisely 1:55. Hodges remembered because the tower clock had just finished striking 2, like a funeral knell, sir, and the gulls all flew up. Whimsy thanked him, paced the nave, examined the inside face of the vestry bolt. Simple brass, unlovely, yet too sturdy for stealthy tampering. He produced a length of fine fishing line, twisted it about the bolt, tested angles. The line caught, slid, but the bolt refused to seat from outside. Whimsy smiled, pocketed the filament, and moved on. At the vicarage, Mrs. Crick, the housekeeper, ushered him through parlor shadows that smelled of beeswax and resignation. Pallithorpe's breakfast tray lay untouched in the scullery, marmalade crusting like amber. Mrs. Crick's eyes brimmed as she recounted a pale envelope delivered yesterday by the midday post. The vicar read it, said, "God forgive me," and burned it in the study grate. He then requested she send young Thomas on his bicycle to Jettison House for that special Armitage parcel, half an hour earlier than customary. The boy returned at 3:25, the tea packet intact, but the rector seemed scarcely to see him. "May I?" Whimsy asked, lifting the silver caddy by its ribboned seal, the same crest as the sachet in the vestry bin, yet this one unbreeched. Curious. Ordered early, yet apparently unused. Bunter, already glancing at the grate, found a charred scrap, a fragment of foolscap bearing the tail of a phrase, "Be before the truth outs." Whimsy tucked it in his wallet, murmuring a schoolboy hexameter about half-burnt heroines. Mid-morning found them back at Jettison House. The butler allowed Whimsy into the plate room, a narrow closet lined like a jeweler's casket. Whimsy weighed teaspoons upon a tiny postal scale borrowed from Bunter's kit. All matched save one slot, conspicuously empty, its label "Teaspoon Pear, Rose Patterns, W.A." He returned to the drawing-room where Mrs. Armitage, flurried but cordial, explained that the set had belonged to her great-aunt Wilhelmina, now deceased of apoplexy and bad investments. "Rose pattern indeed," Whimsy murmured. "One bent, one pristine, like twin nuns, one vowed to silence, the other confessing." He accepted Miss Jettison's offered cigarette, but did not light it. Instead he asked, quite idly, whether the Admiral's long-case clock had been cleaned of late. "It strikes abominably fast," he noted. Miss Jettison blinked, admitted it had gained 4 minutes since Michaelmas, and promised to wind it more sedately. Inspector Paget appeared at noon, coat-tails damp with drizzle, to report the preliminary medical verdict: death by digitalis. Foxglove. "Enough to stop a cavalry horse, administered not more than half an hour before collapse," he said, twisting his mustache. "Bruise on the temple came from the fall. Search shows no bottle." "Digitalis," echoed Whimsy, "is exceedingly bitter. One masks it, if one has good sense, in something strong of flavor and aroma." His gaze rested meaningfully on the silver foil tea caddy atop the sideboard. Perhaps our Reverend dosed himself unknowingly and, reeling, bolted the vestry for privacy. Only privacy became eternity. "Suicide?" Paget ventured. "A cleric who writes a harvest sermon and orders tea for the morrow?" "Unlikely. Besides, why bend a spoon?" Whimsy's eyes danced. "Let me propose an alternative. A visitor arrives bearing a restorative brew, administering the potion by courtesy. When the victim keels over, our visitor retrieves one spoon, finds it disfigured, perhaps by the heat of their guilty hand, drops it at the Armitage table to confuse us, and flees through the nave. The door must be locked to declare impossibility. Therefore the visitor rigs a device, line, hook, bolt, tug, drawing it fast from the churchyard path." Paget frowned. "That sounds devilish elaborate." "Most murders are, when they aspire to artistry." Whimsy glanced seawards through the French windows. "Speaking of artists, does anyone in the parish cast flies for trout?" "Fishermen. Plenty. There's young Dennis Armitage, elder son, more at home on the marsh than the counting-house. Why? Because a fisherman carries translucent gut stronger than finest silk, sufficient to flip a bolt. Whimsy pocketed the straight spoon. Inspector, indulge me. Summon young Dennis after luncheon. Meanwhile, I require exclusive access to the Admiral's clock and one of those anchovy toasts promised by childhood memory. Left alone, he crouched before the long case, listened to its wheezing escapement. 4 minutes fast, indeed, and eased the pendulum until it marched again in honest time. Then, with a deft twist, he removed the minute hand, examined the small square of its brass collar, a film of sticky dark flecks. He sniffed, lips curling. "Foxglove and fish glue," he murmured. "Ingenious. Soak the hand. Restore it. No one the wiser. But why accelerate the chime? To grant an alibi?" Footsteps in the corridor. Bunter entered, bearing a folded oilskin. "Local fisherman loaned me this, my lord, a spool of 8-pound gut. He also mentioned that Mr. Dennis quarrelled with the Reverend over river rights last year. Apparently the rector barred netting during spawning season." Whimsy accepted the spool, ran it through his fingers, and smiled like a cat at the cream jug. "Bunter," he said softly, "string this across the vestry bolt for Inspector Paget's enlightenment. Meanwhile, I shall invite Mr. Dennis to afternoon tea. 1 straight spoon, 1 curved truth, and a ticking clock now shorn of its artificial haste. Time, you see, is fond of revealing conspirators who try to run faster than its own pendulum." Outside, the wind freshened, bringing the scent of iodine and far-off storms. Whimsy stood at the terrace balustrade, eyes narrowed against the glimmering estuary. Somewhere beyond the salt flats, the tide was already creeping inward, erasing footprints, smoothing sand, folding the day's secrets beneath a glistening sheet. But silver, whether spoon or bullet, resists corrosion longer than flesh, and a single twisted gleam might yet guide the hand of justice ashore before nightfall. Whimsy's reverie was broken by the discreet cough of the butler announcing Mr. Dennis Armitage. The young man arrived still smelling of brine. Dark hair uncombed, cuffs flecked with oat husk from the stable yard. He entered as one unused to drawing rooms and eyed Whimsy with mild resentment, as though the detective were another meddlesome keeper on the riverbank. "Tea, Mr. Dennis?" Whimsy asked, offering a chair by the hearth. "Without foxglove, I believe." The flicker in Dennis's grey eyes lasted only a heartbeat. "Been talking to Inspector Paget? He's netting every rumour in the village." "A necessary trawl. I prefer a finer cast." Whimsy poured. "You knew Reverend Pallithorpe well. Knew his rules too well. No night lines, no coarse nets, no baiting near the church meadow. Called it stewardship." Dennis accepted his cup but kept it untouched. "Does that make me a poisoner?" "It makes you a man whose leisure faced ecclesiastical impediments. Did you visit the vestry yesterday?" "Not since Easter, and I can prove where I was at 4, helping old Turner repair a punt. The carpenter'll swear it." "Punt work leaves shavings," Whimsy mused. "None on your jacket now, yet plenty of sand. The tide wall path, perhaps? Convenient for dropping a gut line back through a vestry keyhole once one has looped the bolt." Dennis's shoulders tightened. "That trick needs a steady hand. And time. Turner's place is half a mile away. 7 minutes on a bicycle," Whimsy corrected gently. "A strong rider might dash there and back before Turner warms his glue." He lifted the straight teaspoon. "You lost one of these in the churchyard." "Teaspoons? My mother's?" Dennis gave a short, incredulous laugh. "They'd hardly filch the family silver for homicide. Familial loyalty may bend under strain. Silver, too, if one grips hard enough." Whimsy offered a plate of anchovy toast. Dennis ignored it, gaze fixed on the carpet, jaw working like a man chewing unsaid words. Whimsy waited. Silence, he knew, did more persuasive labor than rhetoric. At last, Dennis exhaled. "Look, I did ride to St. Crispin's, but not to see the vicar. Agnes, Miss Jettison, asked me to fetch her prayer book, which she'd left after choir practice. She was in a state. A state? Whimsy prompted. She said Palathorpe had threatened to expose something, some family matter. I didn't press. Dennis shifted. I got the book, left it in the porch, didn't even go into the vestry. And the teaspoon? Fell from my pocket. Must have snagged when I climbed the railings. Thought it was a fishing swivel till I pulled it out later. I meant to return it. Whimsy twirled his monocle. Curious pocket you have. Brims with cutlery. Nevertheless, I appreciate candor. For now, keep yourself available. He rang for the butler, who showed Dennis out with professional tact. Bunter appeared the moment the door closed. Inspector Paget awaits in the small parlour, my lord. He is somewhat flushed. The inspector was indeed in high colour, brandishing the fishing line Whimsy had requested be strung round the vestry bolt. Ingenious stunt, my lord. 2 pulls on the line, bolt slides home, door appears secured. Tyler managed it in under a minute. Paget's tone held both admiration and reluctance. Yet speed is everything, Whimsy observed. One requires knowledge of the church's acoustics, the congregation's habits, and, importantly, a vantage unseen. You posted constables. 2 on the Lich Gate, 1 on the south porch. No stranger slipped by. Therefore, either the visitor belongs to the parish, or was already within. Whimsy strolled to the window. We must see Miss Agnes Jettison next. Dennis's tale places her at choir practice. Upset. Why? The interview took place in the Admiral's old study, a room lined with naval charts and smelling faintly of pipe tobacco untouched these 10 years. Agnes sat stiff-backed, fingers convulsing in her lap. When Whimsy mentioned blackmail, her composure cracked. He said my father falsified the Admiralty accounts, she whispered. That there were ledgers hidden in the house disproving the estate's solvency. Reverend Palathorpe produced figures, signatures. Swore he would inform the diocesan trustees unless I persuaded Mother to vacate. He wanted the house for a convalescent home. Whimsy's brows arched. Philanthropy by extortion. How Anglican? Did you seek help? I asked Dennis. He's kind. He promised to fetch my prayer book because the vicar claimed I'd left letters in it. She swallowed. If the accounts are forged, Mother is ruined. I couldn't let it become scandal. Nor could the vicar afford public denunciation at synod if his dossier proved counterfeit. Whimsy murmured. A stalemate of reputations. He considered. Did anyone else know of this threat? Agnes closed her eyes. Mr. Armitage overheard a fragment yesterday. I saw him outside the vestry window. He asked later if all was well. The tea merchant, summoned sotto voce, entered wiping imaginary crumbs from his waistcoat. Confronted with Agnes's recital, he paled. I feared she was distressed over rent. I went this morning to urge the vicar to reconsider, but found the constables barring the gate. Yet you were here at tea? Whimsy asked. Returned through the marsh path, 3:30. Lucy will say I came in through the service corridor. Whimsy nodded. And your wife? In the still room. She prepares Christmas preserves from September onward. It was, Whimsy reflected, an alibi more pickled than preserved. Nevertheless, shapes were forming. A debt-burdened family, a pious extortionist, a fisher's son with swift wheels, and a merchant schooled in weighing ounces of leaf and grain, enough to judge a dram of digitalis. Afternoon shadow slanted across the hall. The long case clock, now truthful, struck 3, a deliberate cadence lacking its former haste. Whimsy listened, counted, then beckoned Bunter. Fetch me the Admiral's account ledgers from the attic. If Palathorpe used them as cudgel, we must appraise their heft. Bunter returned within minutes, bearing 2 heavy volumes and a dusting of cobwebs. Whimsy leafed through, scanning Admiralty orders, invoices for fittings, a curious entry regarding silver plate gifted to the Admiral by the East India Company. He paused. Rose-pattern teaspoons. 12, not 10. 2 missing, even then. Outside, gravel crunched. Inspector Paget hurried in. Telegraph from the coroner. Foxglove was infused, not powdered, steeped like tea. Enough mismatch of tannins to suggest 6-minute brewing. Whimsy smiled thinly. A perfectionist's error. 6 minutes yields bitterness. 3 disguises it. Who would oversteep fine Earl Grey? Only one accustomed to robust Assam, merchant or mariner, perhaps. Paget's moustache drooped. You think Armitage Sr.? Consider his motive. Secure the vicar's silence to safeguard tenancy, protect business reputation, preserve Agnes's favor for his son. He possesses teas, spoons, knowledge of flavors, and opportunity inside Jettison House to bend silver in private before tea time, creating a melodramatic diversion should the spoon be missed. Whimsy paced. Yet, the Fisher's line still lingers. If a guest enters and departs unseen, they must circumvent Lucy in the corridor. The marsh path affords rear access through the vestry window. Dennis knew it. Paget rubbed his brow. So which, my lord? Father or son? Perhaps neither. Whimsy returned to the ledgers. The Admiral's accounts. Note this annotation. Converted to bullion, see Reverend P. Our cleric served briefly as executor when Sir Oswald died. He alone might verify missing spoons. He tapped the margin. Suppose Palathorpe discovered that 2 rose-pattern pieces remained unaccounted for, hinted at misappropriation, and thus provoked someone who actually pocketed the Admiral's plate 10 years ago, who then handled the silver, who catalogued it for sale. Agnes's voice, from the doorway, answered unbidden. Mother, she said, ashen. She and the butler, Mr. Hemmings. They listed everything for probate. Hemmings kept the household afloat during father's illness. Mother never questioned him. In 3 strides, Whimsy reached the bell pull. Hemmings appeared, expression gravely blank. Whimsy held out the bent teaspoon. Admiral's plate, misfiled in the pantry, neck torqued by a vice. Your vice, I think. There is one in the butler's pantry for cork extraction. Did Palathorpe confront you yesterday with questions about 2 missing spoons? Hemmings's silence was colder than any denial. Paget stepped forward, but Whimsy lifted a hand. Let us avoid melodrama. Tell us, Hemmings, when the Admiral lay dying, you pawned 2 spoons for the wages that were months in arrears. A forgivable theft, perhaps. But when Palathorpe sought to expose irregularities, you feared prison at your age. So you chose digitalis, easy to obtain from the garden foxgloves you tend, yes? You brewed it strong, served it as a friendly cup in the vestry, then used fishing line, acquired from Mr. Dennis's tackle where it hung in the boot room, to lock the door behind you. You bent the replacement spoon to hint at occult mischief and seeded confusion at tea. Whimsy's voice gentled. There was compassion in it, of a grim sort. You saw a sad, petty man ruining lives with his evidence. Yet murder, Hemmings, refuses to stay a private sin once the kettle cools. The old butler's shoulders sagged like a sail in a dead calm. He said he'd scandalize Miss Agnes, drag the Admiral's honor through the mud for his project. I only meant to make him ill, not... His throat closed. Grief, not temper, wrung the words. I served Sir Oswald 30 years. I couldn't watch his name blackened. Paget moved to take him almost gently by the arm. Hemmings offered no resistance. As they passed the long case clock, it gave a measured tick, tick, steady, unhurried, its honesty restored. Whimsy stood with Agnes and the Armitages in stricken silence. Presently he spoke, gaze on the quiet vestibule where Hemmings disappeared. The bent of a spoon is easily missed, but time, bless it, will have its say, whether accelerated by ambition or slowed by repentance. We shall arrange counsel for Hemmings, Miss Jettison. The court may remember loyalty, if not logic. Outside, the first evening star flirted with the ridgepole, and far off the sea turned lead-shot grey. Whimsy fetched his hat. "Come, Bunter. The tide is in. The evidence, at least, will not drift. I fancy tomorrow we shall have a longer conversation with Admiral Jettison's ledger, and perhaps discover the world is kinder to minor thieves than to moral tyrants." And he stepped into the dusk, the twisted teaspoon at last laid upon the hall table, straightened not in metal, but in meaning, its curve resolved into the final, inevitable line of a very English tragedy. Night settled over Jettison House like a velvet lid, but Lord Peter's mind refused to close. He dismissed the supper tray untouched, exchanged evening coat for an elderly smoking jacket of Oxford blue, and prowled the library with the restlessness of a clever hound that has winded something unsatisfactory in the underbrush. Bunter, polishing the Daimler's lamps before turning in, found his master standing by the darkened window, monocle dangling, gaze fixed on the square tower of St. Crispin's outlined faintly against a milky moon. "Can I fetch the small decanter, my lord?" "No, thank you, Bunter. What I require is not fortification, but subtraction of error." Whimsy tapped the sill. "Hemmings's confession feels tidy, too tidy. A fellow who meant only to make him ill, but brewed a dose fit for an elephant. A butler who bends silver with a cork vice, yet leaves no compression marks, and a gardener so versed in foxglove that he misjudges potency by a factor of 10. It smells, Bunter, of self-sacrifice more than guilt." "Very loyal of him, my lord. Violently loyal." Whimsy smiled without mirth. He would shoulder hanging rather than see the Admiral's name dragged. But self-sacrifice has limits. Hemmings never left the house during service hours. Lucy keeps the pantry key until 3:30. How then did he brew and carry a scalding pot across a quarter-mile of marsh unseen, and still polish the dessert forks for 5 o'clock? The mathematics wobble. Bunter folded his cloth. "Shall I confirm the pantry inventory against the pawnshop receipt you found in the ledger?" "Do. And at 8, we'll call on Dr. Laking across the estuary." His coroner's men measured the digitalis, but didn't specify its form. Infusion or tincture makes a world of difference. The next morning blew in blustery and suspiciously warm. Whimsy and Bunter crossed by ferry to the small town of Saltley, where Dr. Laking practiced beside a chemist's shop dense with blue-glass bottles. The coroner, spectacled and brisk, welcomed Whimsy with a physician's wary curiosity. "Tincture of digitalis, Lord Peter," he confirmed, consulting a notebook. "Alcoholic preparation, not boiled leaf. Bitter indeed, but soluble in spirits. The Reverend had taken perhaps 40 minim doses within 10 minutes. You surfeit." "Thank you," said Whimsy, eyes sharpening. "One last query. Did you detect bergamot oil?" "A trace, beneath the astringency." Back on the ferry, he turned to Bunter. "Tincture is easier to conceal in a liqueur glass than a teacup, yet we smelt Earl Grey, not cognac. Suppose the poison was slipped earlier, under guise of a restorative nip, and the tea merely masked the lingering odor. The spoon riddle returns, my lord." "Exactly. Consider. 2 spoons missing from a set since the Admiral's decline. One appears in the churchyard, the other bent upon Lucy's tray. And whose fingers habitually pocket odds and ends? Not Hemmings. He polishes plate like scripture. Dennis, perhaps, with his casual tackle pockets, or Mr. Armitage Sr., a man who samples thousands of teaspoons of tea weekly, discarding them without thought." Bunter produced a folded slip. "Inventory, sir. The pawnshop ticket lists 2 silver rose-pattern teaspoons, initials O.J., pledged 11 years ago by H.H. That fits Hemmings, yet the butler's pantry today contains exactly 10. Leaving 2 outstanding, one straight, one curved," Whimsy murmured. "Hemmings did pawn them, but must have redeemed only one, or someone else retrieved the pair clandestinely to keep his secret. Perhaps Pallethorpe uncovered the ticket, confronted Hemmings, and was overheard by a third party who feared scandal more keenly." They reached Jettison House to find Inspector Paget awaiting, expression grim. Hemmings collapsed in his cell at dawn. Apoplexy, he announced. Doctor says the shock did it. He may not last. A tragedy, but perhaps a revealing one, Whimsy replied. Dead men's words are weighty. Dying men's silence is heavier. I'll sit with him. Hemmings lay in the tiny infirmary, breath rattling like wind in stovepipes. His eyes fluttered open when Whimsy took his hand. There's mercy yet, Whimsy said quietly. In truth spoken while it matters. Did you bend that spoon, Hemmings? The butler's lips moved. No sound. Whimsy leaned closer. 2 breathy syllables escaped. Not me. Then the old man slipped into a twilight where explanations no longer press. Outside, Paget muttered, That leaves us nowhere. On the contrary, said Whimsy, it leaves us exactly at not me, which is an arrow pointing at someone else. He turned toward the manor. Summon Miss Agnes, Mr. Armitage, his wife, and Dennis. We'll meet in the Admiral's study after luncheon by the long case clock. Now please left at its honest tempo. At 3 minutes to 2, they assembled. The clock's slow tick stitched the hush tighter. Whimsy stood before the wide Georgian window, the bent and straight spoons glinting on the desk. I asked you here, he began lightly, because Hemmings cannot finish his tale. He denied bending the spoon. He did pawn too, long ago, but someone fetched them back. That someone left one in the churchyard and warped the other to dramatize a superstition. The same someone possessed tincture, a merchant's sample bottle, no doubt, and an instinct for timing. Let me reconstruct yesterday. At 2:30, Reverend Palethorpe walked the sea wall, as evidenced by salt on his umbrella. He met a visitor carrying a small flask, something to steady clerical nerves while discussing property ledger entries. They argued. By 3, he had swallowed enough digitalis for fatal arrhythmia, masked in a tot of strong navy rum from the visitor's hip flask. He returned, heart hammering, to the vestry. There the visitor brewed Earl Grey, ostensibly to soothe, truly to overwhelm the coming bitterness, using one of these rose-patterned spoons. But realizing a telltale duplicate might betray the family fraud, our visitor pocketed that spoon, substituting another from Jettison House stores. In haste it was bent, clenched fist, not vice, and slipped into Lucy's sugar bowl to mislead us toward spooks and servants. Palethorpe cramped, staggered, struck his head, then collapsed. The visitor bolted the door with fishing line taken earlier from Dennis's kit, ingenious and swift, and departed through the marsh path. A spoon fell from a coat pocket near the lych gate. Within 10 minutes, death claimed the Reverend. At 3:45, the visitor strolled in by the service corridor, greeted Lucy, and sat to tea amid general innocence. Whimsy turned to Arthur Armitage, whose ruddy complexion had drained to tallow. Only you, sir, fit every particular. You carry rum on chilly afternoons, you command a merchant's tincture samples, digitalis among them, used to demonstrate adulteration, and you arrived precisely when Lucy's clock struck. Moreover, you alone had access to shipment lists revealing the missing teaspoons. Agnes showed you Palethorpe's accusations, and you feared that scandal would annihilate your lease and your son's hopes of marriage. Armitage's hand closed convulsively on the chair arm. Mrs. Armitage gave a small cry, half protest, half dawning comprehension. Dennis stepped forward, face stricken. "Father?" Armitage's voice came hoarse. "I meant no harm to the girl, only to that sanctimonious bully. He sneered at our trade, said tea was a drug as vile as gin, and he would seize the house for his pet charity. I offered settlement." He laughed. "So I dosed him, yes. Just to frighten, to—" He broke off, head sinking. Inspector Paget moved, but Whimsy raised a pallid hand. "One moment more." He faced Agnes. "Miss Jettison, this burden of forged accounts, there is less to it than you feared." Palathorpe inflated trifles to coerce you. The Admiralty will, I think, overlook mislaid plate replaced long ago. Your father died with honor intact. He glanced at Dennis. What remains is human folly, not maritime disgrace. Paget laid a firm hand on Armitage's shoulder. I must take you in, sir? Mrs. Armitage sobbed. Dennis steadied her. Whimsy pocketed the bent spoon, leaving the straight beside the clock. Digitalis, Arthur, is measured in minimes, he said softly. You mismeasured. The market forgives short weight in tea. Nature does not in poison. Outside, clouds scudded, spitting sudden rain that pattered on the window like the ticking of an immense unseen clock. Whimsy watched the constable lead Arthur Armitage toward the waiting police car, its lamps blurting light across gravel, made slick his conscience. Behind him, the long case chimed, the true, deliberate hour. No longer racing, no longer lagging, but proclaiming with unvarnished candor that the appointed moment had arrived. He drew a breath, as though sea wind entered the study, and spoke to the quiet room, though only Bunter could hear. In the end, Bunter, the teaspoon proved a fine chronometer. Its curve marked the instant when fear overbalanced honor. Its return to the table marks restoration. Now the village may steep its tea in peace, though the taste will be saltier for a while. Bunter inclined his head. Shall I pack, my lord? In the morning. Tonight I shall compose a letter to the Home Secretary on Hemmings's loyal silence, and perhaps one to the Admiralty requesting the rose pattern be retired in favor of something less fraught. Meanwhile, fetch 2 cups, no sugar, and the scanty remainder of that decent Darjeeling. We must rinse bitterness from the palate with a draught both honest and mild. And as Bunter departed to obey, Lord Peter Whimsy lowered himself into the Admiral's leather chair, the bent spoon balanced across his palm like a slender scythe, and contemplated the rain until it dwindled to a hush, leaving only the measured tick of a clock that, at last, no longer troubled him. Day broke sullen and pearled with ground mist. Whimsy, ink still wet on his letter to the Home Secretary, stood on the terrace watching gulls wheel above a grey fringe of surf. Their thin cries seemed to fret at the edges of his thoughts. He half expected tranquility now that the handcuffs had clicked. Instead, every instinct in him kept circling the locked vestry like a hound that will not leave it, though its master insists the trail is done. Bunter appeared with coffee in the Morning Post. Inspector Paget wired at dawn, my lord. Mr. Hemmings passed quietly an hour before. He hesitated. There is also a note from the jail surgeon. Mr. Armitage suffered a fainting turn overnight. Asks to speak with your lordship. Conscience sharpens quicker than fever. Whimsy sipped coffee, grimaced. Even bitterness in a cup tells tales. This brew is under-extracted. Lucy must have hurried the kettle. Bunter coughed. Indeed, sir. The servants were up late. Miss Lucy sought me after midnight. She had discovered something in the still-room rubbish basket. From an envelope, he produced a small cylindrical bottle, empty but sticky, its pharmacy label smudged by marmalade peel. Whimsy turned it between finger and thumb. Salt lay, dispensary, tinct, digitalis, 5 minims per dram, dose as directed. Bunter, this is not a merchant sample. It is a household purchase. She found it wedged under the raspberry jam pan. Mrs. Armitage presides there exclusively. Interesting. And the top? He examined the neck. Cork, sliced off with a fruit knife. No screw cap. A woman's expedient when the proper bung pull is locked elsewhere. Fetch Lucy, quietly. The parlour maid arrived pale but determined. I didn't want to cause more trouble, my lord, but I couldn't bear injustice to Mr. Hemmings. That bottle wasn't there yesterday morning. Mrs. Armitage had us all gathering windfalls after lunch, making conserve for the harvest fair. I emptied peelings at 4. The basket was clean then. Did you see her again before tea? No, sir. She keeps the still-room door latched. She came out just before the police arrived, smelling of cloves. Whimsy dismissed her with thanks, then turned to Bunter. Paget must still be content with his prisoner, but evidence grows restive. Let us look at household accounts. Mrs. Armitage, summoned to the morning room, produced her ledger, crimson morocco, entries neat as drilled infantry. Whimsy turned pages. 3 days earlier, Saltley Dispensary, 6 Fortitude, tonic. He looked up. The tea merchant's wife met his gaze blandly. My digestion, Lord Peter. Doctor recommends bitters. Digitalis is a drastic corrective for indigestion. She colored. I can't recall the exact bottle. The dispensary sent what they had. Whimsy let the silence lengthen until the ticking of his pocket watch sounded absurdly loud. At last she said, If you think I murdered a clergyman with my preserves, I think, Whimsy interrupted with sudden gentleness, that loyalty in families takes curious forms. Your husband lies in a cell believing the guilt is his alone. Hemmings believed the same and died under its weight. You, madam, are perhaps less willing to wear chains than to fit them upon others. Her eyes widened, lashes fluttering like moths. That is monstrous. Not so monstrous as digitalis administered in double strength. He laid the empty vial on the escritoire. An ounce of tincture contains 800 minims. Your husband's flask could not deliver half that quantity. The coroner's dose suggests the contents were first reduced, evaporated over gentle heat, perhaps on a preserve stove, then rediluted to mask the change. A still room is admirably equipped for such chemistry. Mrs. Armitage's fingers whitened on the ledger. A single tear slipped, but her voice remained steady. He would have ruined us, ruined Dennis, dragged Agnes into scandal. Arthur kept begging him to relent. I saw it was hopeless. So you prepared the stronger draught, pressed the flask upon your husband as courage. He believed he carried mere persuasion. You carried certainty. The ledger fell shut with a soft thud. She rose. You are clever, Lord Peter, but proof is not cleverness. The tincture might be Hemmings's, might be anyone's. Arthur had samples. You have no witness to what I did or did not distill. Whimsy turned the vial so that morning light glinted on the glass. Proof, Mrs. Armitage, sometimes comes disguised as domestic order. Your accounts list every halfpenny, yet your still-room inventory omits foxglove, though it notes pennyroyal and gentian. One leaves out only what one is anxious to hide, or what one assumes no one will survive to question. Before she could answer, Dennis's voice burst from the doorway. He had entered unseen, face gray with shock. Mother, tell him it isn't true. She started, then folded him into a fierce embrace. Dennis, I did it for you, for all of us. He stepped back, horror and pity warring. You let father take the blame? I never thought Arthur would be arrested. Hemmings confessed. Her composure cracked. She clutched the back of a chair. I hoped the law would settle for a servant's folly. And father would live with that lie. Good God! In the hall, the Admiral's clock tolled 10, echoing like an iron verdict. Whimsy drew a breath. Mrs. Armitage, your husband requests my counsel. I shall see him and learn whether he still believes himself sole engineer of Reverend Ruin. When I return, the inspector will accompany me. Until then, please remain within the house. Mechanically, she nodded. Dennis looked helplessly from mother to detective. Whimsy touched his arm. Courage, lad. Facts bruise, but they disinfect as well. Attend to Miss Jettison. She will require fortitude. The jail at Saltley smelled of lime wash and resignation. Armitage sat on a hard cot, fingers fidgeting with an invisible teaspoon. When Whimsy recounted the still-room discovery, incredulity gave way to dawning despair. Ethel? No, she despises medicine. She faints at the scent of camphor. Yet she knows preserves, evaporation, weights. Whimsy's tone was gentle, as though prying a thorn rather than wielding a blade. She feared poverty more keenly than you suspected, and she treasures your son's prospects above all. To her, Pallithorpe's threats were arrant cruelty. Armitage sagged. If it be true she acted because I lacked the nerve. Perhaps. Will you shield her as she tried to shield you? A long silence. Armitage's shoulders straightened. No. Cowardice breeds in darkness. My boy must not learn chivalry from fraud. He rose. Fetch Paget. I will amend my statement. By late afternoon, Inspector Paget accompanied Whimsy back to Jettison House. Rain pools on the drive mirrored mauve slats of sky. The air smelled washed, yet the house bristled with tension. In the drawing room, Mrs. Armitage awaited, hands clasped upon her apron. Agnes Jettison stood beside her, a quiet pillar of support. Dennis hovered, eyes red. Paget spoke first, formal, restrained. Madame, your husband has supplied evidence suggesting your complicity. He produced the empty vial, gloved in a parchment paper. Do you wish to say anything? She looked at Whimsy. Will Arthur truly be freed? He may still face charges, but the worst will fall where it belongs. Whimsy's voice was low. Confession now may spare the court a spectacle, and your family a greater pain. Her composure dissolved. She recounted haltingly how she had written to the dispensary, how she simmered the tincture over the preserve stove until it thickened to a syrup, how she rebottled it. I thought a little would merely floor him, make him reconsider. I poured a spoonful into Arthur's rum and begged him to make peace quick. I swear I didn't know how strong I'd made it. Paget took the statement, then led her gently away. The door closed on her sobs. Dennis turned to Whimsy with storm-torn eyes. What's left of us now? Your better selves, Whimsy said softly. And the truth, which, though unkind, is at least incorruptible. Tend to it as you would a delicate leaf. You will find it can stand brewing. He left them to their grief and stepped into the hall where the long case murmured. He placed both spoons, bent and straight together on the console. Side by side, imperfect halves of the same pattern. For the first time he noticed they formed, by chance, a rough heart shape where the curve met the pristine stem. Bunter waited with hats and coats. Shall I see about rooms at the inn, my lord? In a moment. Whimsy regarded the spoons. You know, Bunter, Dorothy L. herself would have it that love, when unguided by reason, turns lethal faster than foxglove. Very well. Let us quit this botanical tragedy. The Admiralty will reclaim its silver. The courts will sort the tinctures. As for us, I crave something simpler than tea, perhaps a pint at the Mermaid and a badly racked billiard table. They stepped into the crepuscular air. Over the church tower, a final rag of sunset burned like a banknote too late to be redeemed, then guttered out. Whimsy drew his collar up and, with a faint sigh that might have been relief or weariness, followed the gravel path toward the village lights, where conversation would speak of weather and harvest and leave. Mercifully, both teaspoons and bitter herbs unmentioned, at least until tomorrow's papers arrived. The Mermaid proved as ill-lit and congenial as a Victorian woodcut. Pipes smouldered, dominoes clicked, and briny steam from the publican's seafood pie blurred the lamps so that everyone spoke in a sort of homemade fog. Whimsy accepted a tankard and allowed good evenings to settle round him like accepting an invitation to dance. Bunter stationed himself at the bar with well-rehearsed inconspicuousness. Whimsy had chalked a billiard cue only twice when the ferryman, old Hughes, ambled over. He doffed his cap, eyes astir with the shameless curiosity of a man who ferries both gossip and passengers. Beg pardon, my lord, but you've set the parish buzzing. More doings by the church tonight, they say. Tonight? Whimsy's cue paused mid-swipe. Lantern moving behind the vestry window after dusk, I swear. Thought 'twas the ghost right enough till the constable chased me off for loitering. Locked room or no, someone's rummaging. Whimsy pocketed 3 balls in brisk succession while his mind did quite other arithmetic. Armitage slept behind iron bolts, Mrs. Armitage under warder's eye. Hemmings in the churchyard. Who, then, prowled the vestry? An accomplice? A seeker of yet unfound evidence? Somewhere beneath the flattened froth of conspiracy, another current pulled. He laid aside his cue. "Bunter, finish that drink at pace, then meet me by the west gate of St. Crispin's. Bring the dark lantern." He turned back to Hughes, slipped a coin. "If your ferry should be required later, make it a discreet crossing." Outside, the wind had veered, pushing tatters of mist inland. Gravel hissed underfoot like censorious serpents as Whimsy skirted hedgerows to the church. He avoided the lich gate, choosing instead the side stile that delivered him among yews as black and serried as a choir of undertakers. In the nave, a single lamp glimmered. An illicit glow snuffed the instant footsteps paused on the flagstones. Whimsy waited. Patience is a solvent. Presently a faint creak betrayed the south door. A figure slid out, hugging a flat parcel to its breast. The moon's rim lit dark skirts. Agnes Jettison. She hesitated, sensing presence, then stepped into pathlight and recognized him. "Lord Peter!" Her hushed voice trembled between relief and alarm. "Forgive me, I had to look. The vestry key was still in Dr. Laking's envelope. I couldn't sleep." "You sought what Palethorpe hid?" "Yes. He claimed proof of father's dishonor. I thought, see if I could destroy it, mother's ordeal might ease." She unfolded creased foolscap. Whimsy's lantern revealed lists of ship chandler invoices, admiralty requisitions, and the same rose-pattern item repeated with annotations. But scrawled across the margin in the vicar's angular hand was a note. "To remain withheld for conscience. Will reveal Sunday." Beneath, a penciled calculation that made Whimsy's brows rise. A conversion of Troy ounces into sovereigns. He whistled soundlessly. Palethorpe believed the spoons were not trinkets, but bullion melted down and recast, coin of the realm disguised and siphoned from naval stores. Smuggling, my dear Miss Jettison, of a most genteel order. Agnes pressed a hand to her throat. Then father's ledger was worse than error. It was embezzlement, or patriotic sleight of hand during lean wartime budgets, yet blackmailable either way. Whimsy folded the papers. "These must reach Paget, but lest we ruin what remains of the Admiral's memory, let us first verify." Bunter arrived, silent as custom, and together they climbed the worn staircase to the belfry, where brittle straw and pigeon droppings rustled underfoot. Whimsy located the recess shown in Palethorpe's margin map, a hollow behind St. Crispin's stone, then drew out a canvas pouch. Inside lay the missing 12th spoon and, astonishingly, a slender ingot stamped with a barely legible crown mint mark. "Foxed me thoroughly," Whimsy murmured, weighing it. Melted guineas poured into flagons, hammered into spoons. The Admiral may have steered more gold than gunboats. He glanced at Agnes, whose features mixed dread and rueful amusement. "Your father served the Crown in ways the Crown could never publicly thank." Agnes's sigh ghosted between beams. If Palethorpe had understood that, he might have kept silent. Blackmail cares nothing for nuance. Whimsy wrapped the ingot, but someone besides the Reverend also understood, or guessed, and feared discovery enough to slay. Armitage sought to silence scandal. Mrs. Armitage sharpened the remedy. Yet who pointed Palethorpe to buried treasure? Who first redeemed the spoons from pawn? They descended. Whimsy sent Bunter to deposit Agnes safely with Lucy, then swung toward the vicarage. Dr. Laking's seal on the study door remained intact, but in the scullery a faint draught stirred. He followed it to the coal hatch, unlatched from inside. A smear of coal dust on the sill bore fresh boot marks leading out to the garden path. Palethorpe's murderer had returned earlier, perhaps before Mrs. Armitage's confession, perhaps seeking this very ingot. Failing to find it, they continued to rummage, daring constables. The boot print, narrow heel, pointed toe, was no fisherman's hobnail. It suggested a city shoe careful of mud. Whimsy measured stride to the perimeter gate, where recent bicycle tracks scored the damp lane. Tires slim, treads shallow. In his notebook he sketched the pattern. Back at Jettison House, the household lights still burned. He rapped lightly, and Dennis ushered him to the library, eyes wary. Whimsy placed the ingot on the table. Gold glowed honey-dull in the lamplight. The Sunday school funds hardly require such reserves, Whimsy observed. Has this ever crossed your path? Dennis stared. Never. What of your father's associate riders? I noted the tire marks of a lightweight Humber, same make as your clerk, Mr. Willoughby favours. He catalogues shipments, yes? Dennis blinked. Willoughby. He keeps the wage ledgers, but he's timid as a dormouse. Timid men with ledgers sometimes crave leverage over their betters. Imagine a clerk who discovers the Admiral's pawn ticket among arrears. He redeems 2 spoons, discovers they weigh strangely heavy. He assays a sliver, finds gold. He keeps 1 spoon, returns the other to the plate chest to watch who notices. Pallythorpe notices, of course, a man ever sniffing for moral rot. The clerk presents evidence for a price. Pallythorpe refuses hush money, threatening exposure. The clerk's livelihood is doomed, unless someone else silences the threat. Dennis's complexion paled to parchment. If Willoughby rode out tonight, he said he must check the mailbags. Let us pay him a courtesy call. Whimsy signalled Bunter, who already had the Daimler's headlamps slicing mist along the lane. They reached the Armitage warehouse near the wharf. A single office window glimmered. Inside, Willoughby, slight and spectacled, ransacked a safe, papers scattered like frightened dove. As the Daimler's twin beams flooded the room, he froze, 1 foot on a stool, a pistol, satirical in his fragile hands, dangling. Whimsy entered first, palms displayed. Evening, Willoughby. Collecting vouchers? The clerk's voice scraped raw. You won't hang me. I never meant death. Pallythorpe forced my hand, spewing brimstone. I only gave Arthur the idea, told him a dram would cow the Reverend. Then the wife brewed double, and it tumbled out of reach. Tears glimmered round wire rims. I came for the last spoon, the one I kept. Proof of nothing now, but perhaps enough to pawn passage abroad. A prudent imagination, but poor arithmetic, Whimsy said. There is arsenic in notoriety. It stains whatever it touches. Put the pistol down, man. It's loaded with more trouble than bullets. Willoughby's shoulders collapsed. Bunter relieved him of the weapon. Dennis, entering behind, stared at his clerk with stunned disappointment. Why didn't you ask me for help? You have a future, Willoughby whispered. I have ledgers and a widowed mother. Inspector Paget, roused by telephone, arrived to place the second set of cuffs in as many days. While the constables escorted Willoughby away, Whimsy extracted a small package from the safe. The final rose-patterned spoon, weighty as conscience. He handed it to Dennis. Return this to the Admiralty when the uproar subsides. They may melt it into medals, or paperweights for Whitehall. Your family has paid enough interest on hidden bullion. Dawn plucked the horizon again as Whimsy and Bunter motored back. Over the estuary the tide withdrew, leaving ribs of wet sand gleaming like an unburied skeleton. Whimsy murmured, half to the wind, a simple chemical poisoning evolves into gold, embezzlement, smuggling, and a clerk's desperation. Human affairs mimic chain reactions, Bunter. One applies heat to tincture and finds the world explodes. At least the teaspoons are accounted for, my lord. Yes, and Hemmings may rest easier for the Admiral's honour. Shame Mrs. Armitage brewed her morality too strong. Willoughby brewed his too weak, but between them they composed a perfect liability. They slowed outside the church. Whimsy gazed at its silent silhouette. Curious things, relics. A bent spoon led us by the nose. A straight one will close the loop at the coroner's inquest. But somewhere between distortions lies the original design, and that, thank heaven, is usually plain enough for those willing to look past the tarnish. He stepped from the car, stretched, and smiled faintly. "Breakfast, Bunter. Eggs untainted, toast unburnt, and coffee that neither condemns nor absolves, merely sustains. After which we shall draft a more intricate letter to the Treasury about stray ingots masquerading as flatware." Bunter inclined, dutiful and dry. "Very good, my lord. One hopes the Treasury will take it better than the gastric system of St. Crispin's." And together they walked towards Jettison House, where the daylight, thin but honest, promised at last to steep every lingering shadow to its proper strength. The breakfast coffee proved, mercifully, neither condemnatory nor absolving. Whimsy, restored by 2 soft-boiled eggs, dictated a letter to the Treasury, while Bunter typed the discovery of clandestine bullion in the shape of naval flatware, a clerk in custody who might illuminate how often gold had ridden incognito through Her Majesty's customs. In courteous phrases, Whimsy suggested a quiet audit of Admiralty supply chains circa 1914, a ticklish era when logistics occasionally outpaced ethics. He sealed the envelope and sent Bunter off with Dennis to telegraph it under cipher. Left alone, Whimsy wandered into the Admiral's study. The room felt subtly lighter, as though years of unspoken weight had been lifted the way one hoiks a damp rug off a floor. Yet the air had not cleared entirely. Guilt clung in eddies, like pipe smoke that persists no matter how wide one flings the sash. The long case clock chimed 9, truthful and sedate. Whimsy's gaze fell to the pair of spoons he had arranged the night before. A gleam caught his eye, something on the bowl of the bent one that the lamplight had not revealed. A faint, reddish sheen, almost microscopic. Hemoglobin? No, the vicar had struck his head after collapsing, not before, and the spoon had lived in the still room. He touched a forefinger to it. The speck flaked away. Coppery, metallic, gold amalgam. He fetched a lens. Yes, a minuscule bead of solar, where the bowl met the stem, crude compared with the Admiral's usual workmanship. Someone had repaired the spoon recently, and in a hurry. He set the lens down, lips pursed. A rushed mend suggested the spoon had cracked under pressure, perhaps when Mrs. Armitage bent it. Yet she would hardly solder silver to hide a fault she meant as red herring. More plausibly, the spoon had broken earlier at an inconvenient moment, say, when Willoughby first tested its weight and clipped a sliver for assay. If so, where was the missing sliver, and what else had Willoughby clipped? Bunter re-entered. "Telegram dispatched, my lord. Mr. Dennis says Willoughby's ledgers stretch back 5 years. He volunteers them for inspection." Capital. But before we drown in numbers, we must draw Phoenix from its ashes. Whimsy indicated the spoon. "Notice this solder. Willoughby's doing, I wager. If he tested one spoon, he likely sampled others. We must search his lodgings before the constabulary puts seals upon everything." They commandeered Dennis's gig and rattled toward a row of modest cottages beyond the marsh. Willoughby's quarters occupied 2 attic rooms above a haberdasher's. The landlady, flustered by morning notoriety, admitted them with a key the constables hadn't yet collected. Whimsy paced the narrow space where stacks of paper formed topographical hazards on every surface. On a side table stood a spirit lamp, crucible, and a scorched spoon rest, the sort itinerant assayists favor. In the grate lay fragments of melted wax impressed with the seal of St. Crispin's vestry, a device tiny enough to stamp a bundle of private letters. Next to it, a charred envelope bore Agnes Jettison's handwriting. "Blackmail drafts," Whimsy murmured. He threatened with one hand, soothed with the other. He rummaged in an account box and produced slips noting payments from Palathorpe to Whodunit over 9 months. Small sums that suddenly doubled a week before the vicar's death. Palathorpe was paying for silence until he decided to condemn the Admiral publicly. Willoughby, sensing the well drying, turned to the Armitages for a faster dividend. Bunter held up a crumpled bank wrapper, National Provincial, containing a single sovereign and a curiously shaped sliver of metal rounded at one end like a spoon's rim. The other side glittered raw gold. "Evidence enough to satisfy the Crown," said Wimsey, pocketing the sliver. "Yet one mystery nags. Willoughby spoke of Mrs. Armitage's double brew, but he had no way to know its potency. How did he learn she had concentrated the tincture?" Bunter's brow furrowed. "He may have watched from the scullery garden. The still-room window opens toward the lane." "Perhaps. Let us confirm." They returned to Jettison House. Paget's constables bristled at the gate, but Wimsey's status and the inspector's forewarning parted them. In the still room, the copper pans had been cleaned, but a faint, bitter tang of foxglove lingered in the grain of the wooden table. Wimsey opened the side shutter and looked across the lane. A clear view to Willoughby's bicycling route, and, crucially, the reflecting panes of the warehouse window, mirrors at dusk for anyone patient enough to watch. Willoughby could indeed have observed the simmering flask. But observation alone did not explain the second boot print Wimsey had noted at the vicarage coal hatch. Wider tread, heavier heel. Constables had dismissed it as earlier traffic. Wimsey was less sanguine. He borrowed a spade and trekked to the shed where garden boots were stored. Hemming's pears awaited, broad, ancient, caked with clay. But a second pair, Arthur Armitage's Wellingtons, showed subtle smears of coal dust across the instep. The date intrigued Wimsey, as Armitage had been locked up since the day before. Coal dust degraded in damp, though smears were newer. Dennis found him studying the boots. "I cleaned the grate yesterday," Dennis said, "to keep busy. Father's wellies may have picked up coal then." "Possibly." Wimsey's tone invited contemplation. Dennis flushed. "I didn't go to the vicarage, if that's what you imply." "I imply only that Palathorpe's coal hatch suggests comings and goings even after death. If not you, what about Lucy? She ran errands for the vicar." Dennis shook his head. Lucy scarcely left Mother's side. Wimsey accepted the answer but stored it. He excused himself and went seeking Lucy. He found her folding linens in the airing cupboard, face blotched with weeping. When he mentioned coal dust, her composure cracked. "It was me, my lord. I fetched the vicar's laundry Wednesday evenings. After the tragedy, I crept round to collect it before reporters could pry. I left footprints, I'm sorry. I never touched the Reverend's study." Wimsey believed her. The detail matched parish custom and her own timorous nature. The coal print sang no longer. Returning to the still room, he encountered Agnes, a shawl about her shoulders. She stared at the pans. "Does one bruise mend when another begins, Lord Peter? Mother will stand trial. Willoughby, too. Father may be free in law, but he will never shed that chain." "Chains can be dissolved," Wimsey said softly, "if you dip them long enough in a solvent called time and honest labor. The firm needs sound management. You and Dennis together could supply it." Her eyes shone, then shadowed. "If society lets us." "Society has a short memory for commerce that fills its teacups." He smiled. "See the opportunity, not the shame." They walked through the orchard where windfalls sweetened the grass. Wimsey stooped, picked up a wrinkled apple, and rubbed it on his sleeve. "Curious," he mused, holding the fruit so Agnes could see. A small puncture near the stem, tiny, clean, as if a syringe had... He stopped. Digitalis could be concentrated and injected into an apple as easily as dissolved in rum. An injected apple would taste hardly of anything until one bit the puncture. Palathorpe had strong teeth. A small crunch could deliver enough tincture directly. Mrs. Armitage's confession assumed she had doctored the rum because she had poured it. But what if someone else had prepared an emergency dose, hidden in fruit, and Palathorpe, by chance or habit, had eaten it before the tea arrived? His pulse quickened. He retrieved the apple pomologist's lens again. Faint red streaks radiated from the puncture, residue of alcohol. Wilted leaf attached to stem seemed brushed with clay, the color of warehouse dust, not garden soil. Back in the study, he laid the apple beside the solid spoon. Armitage's rum, Mrs. Armitage's pan, Willoughby's blackmail, Hemmings's despair, threads woven by separate hands but knotted by chance into fatal tapestry. Suppose Willoughby, fearing Mrs. Armitage's mixture might prove too timid, prepared a surer contingency, an apple infused through a narrow glass pipette. The vicar, half famished after sea-wall walk, would bite. The dose would act swiftly, yet look like natural collapse aggravated by tea. Whimsy hurried to the police office, where Willoughby awaited transfer. The clerk sat wearily, wrists in irons, but glanced up with haunted cleverness. "Something else, my lord?" "Yes," Whimsy said quietly, producing the apple. "Were you fond of needlework at school?" Willoughby's mouth twisted. "Chemistry club. We injected dye into oranges once to amuse the girls." "Old habits survive," Whimsy murmured. "Did you amuse yourself likewise with God's own fruit?" Willoughby's shoulders slumped. "I couldn't risk her pan failing. The Reverend was stubborn, Lord Peter. He might have poured the tea away, but he'd never refuse an apple from his own tree. One plunge of a fountain pen barrel, it holds 15 drops. Enough. So Mrs. Armitage's confession, though sincere, was incomplete. Her brew might have done eventually, but your apple struck the first blow." Tears leaked behind the spectacles. She was frantic. "I thought to finish it tidy and leave her none the wiser." Paget, listening, cursed under his breath. He called for new constables. The charge sheet grew baroque. Outside, Whimsy leaned against the stone wall, exhaustion seeping into his bones. Bunter materialized with an overcoat. "The chain reaction, my lord?" "Contained," Whimsy said, "though not without singeing half the parish." He rubbed his temple. "Curious Bunter, every guilty soul acted from some twisted kindness, to spare scandal, to preserve livelihood, to defend love. They brewed too hot, spoiling the cup." Bunter buttoned the collar. "And you, my lord, what will you brew next?" Whimsy managed a wan smile. "Something exceedingly mild. Perhaps a broth from my aunt's sanest cook, followed by a week in town reading nothing more inflammatory than Debrett's." He straightened. "Fetch the Daimler. We will deliver our apple to Dr. Laking for toxicology. Then, by your leave, abandon Jettison to its salvage. The tide has carried off enough secrets for a lifetime." They drove away through drizzle, the estuary shrugging silver shoulders beneath a lifting sky. Behind them, St. Crispin's tower receded, Bell silent at last, and at the bend of the lane, Whimsy allowed himself a single private yawn, half fatigue, half relief, before the road turned inland toward a future where no spoon, however slightly bent, awaited his next pedantic notice. Dr. Laking received the apple with the professional animation of a lepidopterist handed a rare moth still fluttering. Within an hour, he telephoned the constabulary. The fruit's flesh showed concentric rings of digitalis precipitate, forced inward through a hollow needle, not tincture merely smeared, but deliberately embedded. The dosage, he judged, could have alone induced fatal fibrillation in a healthy man, let alone a cleric of Palathorpe's uncertain constitution. Whimsy rang off, replaced the receiver, and stared a moment at the instrument as though half expecting it to continue the conversation without him. "So," he said to Bunter, "Mrs. Armitage furnished the tragic overture, but our shy accountant struck the downbeat that finished the performance. Both poisons together played double time. One could almost admire the counterpoint were it not written in a minor key of corpses." Inspector Paget, summoned, listened grimly while Laking presented his microphotographs of stained apple cells looking, under magnification, like crimson galaxies. "Enough evidence for 2 Crown trials," the inspector concluded. Yet his eyes shifted to Whimsy with the unspoken appeal of a man who wishes the paperwork, might somehow further simplify itself. Whimsy obliged, after his fashion, by making it infinitely more complex before it became simpler. I wonder, he mused aloud, whether we should content ourselves with the obvious twosome when the choir may still contain an unvoiced tenor. Willoughby's statement names no accomplice. He claims solitary ingenuity. Yet the logistics of injecting an apple undetected strain credulity. The vicar kept his orchard locked behind the sexton's shed. Picking fruit would risk notice. Somebody with parish freedom must have supplied the medium. Dennis Armitage, Paget ventured, half resigned to further revelations. A possibility, except he spent the afternoon on the river with the carpenter, a fact confirmed by half Saltley. And Lucy was in the still room from 2 till 4. No, I think we must look to a pair of hands already accustomed to orchard ladders and vestry errands. Palathorpe's own verger? Hodges? Whimsy shook his head. An honest old gargoyle. He loathes apples on account of his dentures. But the vicarage gardener, young Thomas who cycles messages, now there lies a chap unfettered by either scruples or schedules. Paget snorted. A boy, his wrists are thinner than that apple core. Vice requires neither breadth nor height. Whimsy's gaze drifted to the laboratory window where Thomas's bicycle, commandeered earlier as evidence, leaned against a hoop of hose. Its handlebar grip was wrapped with a strip of red-stained cloth, very like the binding found round the apple's stem. The inspector frowned, nodded, and sent Tyler to fetch the lad. They found Thomas in the churchyard, sulkily stuffing weeds into a barrow. Confronted with the cloth, he blustered, then wilted, then sobbed a confession whose gist ran thus. Willoughby had paid him 6pence to pluck an unblemished russet from the rectory tree and hold it steady while the clerk did a funny trick with a pen. Thomas, dazzled by coin, had asked no questions, only slipped the apple into the Reverend's letter basket in the vestry exactly as instructed. For silence, he was promised a shilling more after Harvest Festival. Palathorpe died the next day. The promised shilling became a backhanded threat. Speke and police would accuse Thomas of murder. Since then, the boy had avoided everyone, heart clanging like a cracked bell. Paget rubbed his moustache until it bristled like an angry hedgehog. Accessory after the fact, he said, but Whimsy stayed his hand. Spare him cells and chalk up another victim to adult dishonesty. His testimony will suffice. He addressed Thomas gently. You will repeat your tale in court, and thereafter, I dare say Mr. Dennis can find you honest employment in the warehouse, if you prefer shillings earned to those feared. The boy nodded, tears and hope mingling freely, and Whimsy, satisfied that the chorus at last possessed all its voices, turned to Paget. We may now write the program notes. Late next morning the villagers crowded the nave, drawn by rumour of Lord Peter's service of explanation, a phrase coined by Paget in exasperation. The constabulary manned the doors, but no one intended trouble. They came as one attends the final act of a satisfying, if ghoulish, drama. Up in the chancel, Whimsy stood beside the lectern, looking peculiarly priestly himself, in a narrow black frock-coat. On a table before him lay the artifacts, the bent and solid spoons, the ingot, the stained apple under glass, Willoughby's assay sliver, Mrs. Armitage's empty vial, and a neat pile of ledgers. Agnes played involuntary acolyte, turning pages in the marriage register to the ink-blotted leaf the Reverend had spoiled with his dying sprawl. Whimsy's voice carried, conversational yet resonant. He traced the adultery of greed across pages, demonstrating how the Admiral had melted illicit gold, how Hemmings's pawn ticket became Willoughby's lever, how the clerk milked both blackmail and heroic pretensions, and how Mrs. Armitage, frantic to shield family from ruin, brewed her too strong cordial. Finally, he described Thomas's apple mission, the fatal kernel round which all other errors fermented. Paget stepped forward then, reading the formal charges. Mrs. Armitage, pale but erect, heard hers. manslaughter by administration of poison, while Willoughby, trembling, learned the heavier indictment, murder, compounded by blackmail. The boy Thomas would testify under leniency. In the shifting hush, even the church swallows seemed to hold their breath. When proceedings concluded, Agnes shut the register, her hand lingering on its too blue blot. Whimsy, seeing her expression, bent low. "Ink may blur the page, Miss Jettison, but it cannot erase your father's worth. Let history weigh gold against service. I suspect the scales will tip in his favor." Dennis led his mother away between two matronly parishioners, offering shawls and whispered sympathy. A few pews back, Arthur Armitage, released on recognizance pending trial, met Whimsy's eyes with a weary gratitude. A merchant who daily graded teas now knew precisely how bitter the rarest leaf could brew. That evening, Whimsy and Bunter inhabited a railway compartment bound for London, facing each other across a copy of the Times whose headlines trumpeted "Kent Clergyman Poison Case, Gold Smuggling Link." Whimsy lowered the paper, absently twirling the repaired spoon which he had, with Paget's indulgence, retained as a memento. "Bunter," he said, "have you noticed that while law punishes crime, it is logic that forgives it? Mrs. Armitage will likely be shown mercy, mitigating circumstance, the doctor's evidence that her draught alone might not have killed. Willoughby, alas, knitted his own noose with figures and decimals." "Very nearly literal, my lord," Bunter agreed, eyes flicking to the grim subheading concerning possible capital charges. "And Hemmings. The court will record his innocence, posthumous though it be, and Jettison House will keep his portrait in the servants' hall. I shall see to it." He tapped the spoon solar. A flawed join, yet holding firm, rather like the parish itself. Night blurred country lights into damp smears against the carriage windows. Whimsy lapsed into thought, murmured lines from Donne about gold to airy thinness. Beat, then, recollecting himself, he smiled. "Bunter, once we reach Piccadilly, remind Parker to dine. He loves a yarn with Navy intrigue. It will make him forget for an hour that Scotland Yard still owes him a promotion. And perhaps, my lord, you might forget for an evening about bent silver." Whimsy slipped the spoon into his pocket. "Unlikely, though I may cease to lecture it. Still, the next time a hostess offers me Earl Grey, I shall inspect both tincture and teaspoon before sipping." The train rattled onward through tunnels smelling of soot and damp creosote. Somewhere beyond the glass, the estuary continued its endless tides, smoothing over footprints, swallowing apple cores and fisher's line, polishing the bones of secrets until only bright, unblemished stories remained for future winter hearths. And if one listened closely between the clang of rails and the puff of steam, one might imagine a faint, mocking chime, the honest tick of a Kentish clock that kept, at last, impeccably truthful time. The soft clatter of the train on the rails seemed to mark the steady progression not only of their journey, but of the investigation itself, a slow unfolding from darkness to a kind of clarity, albeit one tinged with the inevitable shadows cast by human frailty. Whimsy, seated by the window, traced a pale finger along the condensation gathering on the glass, as though willing the landscape outside to reveal more than the passing fields and distant church spires. His mind, however, was less occupied with scenery than with the intricate web of motives, alibis, and half-truths that had consumed his attention since the afternoon in Pallithorpe's vicarage. Bunter, sitting opposite, watched his lord with an expression of patient attentiveness. "You appear thoughtful, my lord. Might I hazard that the pieces have fallen into place?" Whimsy allowed a faint smile, a brief concession to camaraderie. "Pieces, yes. But the final picture, the very raison d'etre of this choreographed tragedy, remains tantalizingly elusive. It is one thing to identify the culprit and another to understand the mechanism by which the gears turned, invisible to all but the most discerning eye." He glanced once more at the bent teaspoon, now glinting under the carriage lamp's muted glow. The slight warp in the silver spoke to a delicate manipulation, too subtle for most to notice, yet crucial in the orchestration of the crime. The bent teaspoon was not merely a fluke of misfortune, but a deliberate signature, a kind of quiet punctuation mark in an otherwise verbose statement. But to what end? Bunter folded the newspaper with measured care. You have the key facts: the adulterated apple, the digitalis, the falsified gold ingot, and the ever-resourceful Willoughby, who sought to conceal both his debts and his duplicity beneath clerical vestments. Yet the question lingers. How was the fatal concoction administered without arousing suspicion, and who, if anyone, assisted in the deed? Wimsey's eyes narrowed slightly. The assistance was subtle, yet unmistakable upon reflection. Thomas's role as unwitting accessory is clear, but the shadows between him and the accused reveal a network of silent complicity. Consider the gardener's schedule. His habitual absences coincide precisely with Willoughby's excursions to the vicarage orchard. A young man cycling messages might easily transport poisons, messages, or even forged documents without notice. He tapped the spoon. Then there is Mrs. Armitage's desperate mixture, designed to mask and confuse. A woman of evident love and loyalty, yet also one cornered by circumstance and fear. Her administration of the cordial at the harvest supper was an act of both mercy and miscalculation. The true fulcrum of this tragedy lies in the collision of intentions. Blackmail meets protective desperation. The train's rhythmic motion seemed to underscore his words, the steady pulse of wheels on rails echoing the methodical unspooling of secrets. But there is still a finer thread, Bunter. The chronological discrepancies we noted in the earlier interviews. Willoughby's alibi crumbles when juxtaposed with clock observations and servant routines. The silenced bell in the parish tower that afternoon, the misaligned curtains in the vestry, the locked desk whose key was absent. These details are more than mere background. They are the scaffolding of a meticulously constructed illusion. Bunter nodded. The silent bell. An intentional gagging of the timekeeper's voice. One might think it irrelevant, yet it gave Willoughby the cover to move unseen, to substitute documents, or to slip the poisoned apple unnoticed. Precisely. Wimsey leaned back, eyes distant, and the missing salver, replaced surreptitiously by an identical but unmarked piece, reveals a careful stagecraft. The vicar's accustomed routines were known and manipulated. It was not merely an act of passion or panic, but of rehearsed calculation. Their conversation was interrupted as the train pulled into London's Waterloo station. The bustle of arrival brought the weight of their discovery back to the tangible world, the labyrinthine corridors of justice, the inevitable trial, the theatre of public opinion. Later that evening, in his London lodgings, Wimsey spread out the documents and notes accumulated during the past fortnight. Each page bore the subtle marks of concealed anxieties, a slightly smudged ink line here, a hastily erased figure there. He observed them with the patient gaze of a man piecing together a delicate mosaic. The ledger entries were particularly telling. Willoughby's handwriting betrayed a nervous precision, the margins crowded with figures that fluctuated between bookkeeping and coded confessions. The style suggested a mind perpetually balancing the desire for order against the chaos of his illicit schemes. Wimsey's thoughts drifted to the psychological dimension. Jealousy and revenge may fuel many crimes, but here the motive is a treacherous cocktail of fear and ambition. Willoughby was drowning beneath his debts, ashamed before his parish and peers, desperate to maintain a facade of clerical probity while siphoning funds into shadow accounts. Yet he lacked the courage to confront exposure openly, hence the cloak of poison and deception. He considered Mrs. Armitage's role anew. Her love, mingled with terror, led her to meddle where she should have merely counseled. It is a cautionary tale of good intentions wielded like a blunt instrument. Just then, The doorbell announced a visitor. Parker, returning from the yard, entered with the habitual mixture of fatigue and curiosity that accompanied his updates on the case. "Good evening, my lord," Parker said briskly, dropping a file onto the desk. "We've had further developments. The court is preparing for arraignment, but there's a wrinkle. A letter surfaced today, unsigned and apparently penned in the vicar's own hand, warning of impending ruin and hinting at knowledge of some secret." Whimsy took the letter, reading the elegant script that spoke of dread and concealed truths. "A posthumous voice," he murmured. "Palathorpe's last testament to a world he could no longer face." Parker shrugged. "It complicates matters, but it also confirms the vicar's awareness of threats beyond mere fiscal misdeeds. The question is, did Willoughby truly act alone, or was he protecting another's interest?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed. A final act yet to be revealed, a shadow beyond the shadow. The human heart is an uncharted country, my friend, with maps drawn in ink and blood. The night deepened, London's lights flickering like distant stars as the detective resumed his solitary contemplation. The pieces lay before him, some jagged, some smooth, waiting for the precise moment to coalesce into the unerring shape of truth. And as always, Whimsy remained the poised conductor, guiding the silent orchestra toward its final, inexorable crescendo. The following morning dawned with that sort of grim clarity which follows a storm, and London, in its habitual grey resolve, seemed indifferent to any private tragedy or moral reckoning. Whimsy, however, was already dressed, breakfasted, and making mental arrangements in the study when Bunter entered with the morning post. "Nothing of substance, my lord, save one item. It was hand-delivered by an errand boy, no return address." Whimsy took the envelope between two fingers, noting the slightly crumpled edge and the faintest smear of ink at the corner. It bore no crest, but the handwriting, angular, strained, was familiar. With a flick of his penknife, he slit it open, unfolded the paper, and began to read. A soft exhalation passed his lips, half amused, half pained. "Interesting," he murmured. "Willoughby finally cracks the varnish, though I dare say it was less confession than contingency. He wrote this 2 days before the harvest supper. It reads like a man who expected either martyrdom or absolution, but certainly not arrest." He read aloud, voice level but dry. "Should I not return from what I am about to undertake, let it be known that I acted to protect the legacy of the Church, the decency of the people, and the weakness of one dearer to me than I can admit. My sin is manifold, but not without cause. Do not judge the woman too harshly. She tried to dissuade me." He lowered the letter. "So, the protective instinct once more. It would be touching, were it not so muddled with fraud, poison, and a regrettable taste in forgery." Bunter, who had grown over the years adept at recognizing the tipping point in his master's reflections, inclined his head. "Does this alter your approach to the final confrontation, my lord?" "It enriches it," said Whimsy, standing. "The trick, Bunter, is not merely to gather facts that any competent inspector can do. The art lies in showing a man his own reflection and letting the horror dawn of its own accord." They departed shortly thereafter, heading not for the yard, but back to Palathorpe, where the threads had begun, and where they must ultimately be tied off. The local constable, Sergeant Metcalfe, met them at the station with the diffidence of a man half grateful and half wounded at the intrusion of aristocratic method into rural certainty. "I understand you intend to speak again with Miss Armitage?" Metcalfe asked as they clattered toward the rectory in his Morris car. "She's not been charged, sir, and frankly, I'm not sure what she can add." "No, indeed, Metcalfe," said Whimsy lightly. "What she adds will not be evidence in the usual sense. It will be atmosphere, motive, context, and the final link in a chain that has long been hidden beneath the vicar's robes." Miss Armitage was seated by the hearth when they arrived, dressed plainly, her eyes far older than her years. The parlour, though tidy, held a thin layer of melancholy, as though the very walls awaited either vindication or collapse. "I knew you'd return, Lord Peter," she said without preamble. "You have that look about you, a man who does not find puzzles tolerable unless completed." Wimsey bowed slightly. "A fair criticism. I come not with accusation, but with comprehension, and a question or two, if you'll indulge me." She nodded, her hands tightly clasped. "You loved him," Wimsey said gently. "Not merely as a parishioner admires her vicar. You loved him in a way he could neither acknowledge nor reject, and he, being both weak and vain, permitted it, leaned on it, until it became a tether." A single tear slipped down her cheek, but her voice was firm. "He never promised, not in words, but he let me hope. I thought if I could protect him, fix it, all would be well. You knew about the embezzlement." "Yes. And the forgery." "I suspected." Wimsey sat across from her, drawing a small silver object from his pocket. The teaspoon, slightly bent. He laid it on the table between them like a relic from a crime scene or a battlefield. This spoon came from the service laid out at the harvest supper, bent, you see, at a delicate angle. Subtle, but not accidental. It matched precisely the warp in the tea service kept in the locked sideboard. The replacement was hasty, because one poisoned piece, had to be destroyed. Her eyes flicked to it, then back. "I put that service away myself. I didn't notice." "No," said Wimsey quietly. "You wouldn't have. But Willoughby did. That's why he used it. He knew it would not be questioned. You see, Miss Armitage, he gave the cordial to Thomas because he believed Thomas was already doomed. Your mixture, meant to ease Thomas's breathing, was not poisoned, but he used that moment to mask the administration of the apple. The fatal element had already been introduced. Your act, well-intentioned, merely helped conceal the timing." She flinched. "I didn't know. I swear it." "I believe you," said Wimsey, "and so does the Yard. There'll be no charges against you, but I must ask, did he ever mention his connection to a certain Edith Brentwood?" The name struck its target. Her face changed, not from ignorance, but from recognition, suppressed by years of discretion. He never said the name. But he had letters, locked away. Old letters, very personal. I once caught a glimpse of one. Signed with an E, I never asked." "Edith Brentwood," Wimsey repeated. "A woman who died young, whose inheritance passed, oddly enough, not to her next of kin, but to the church through a trust Willoughby managed. And curiously, that trust shows signs of tampering, transfers that trace back to the same fund from which the gold ingot was fabricated." Miss Armitage paled. "You think he killed her?" "No," said Wimsey. "I think he loved her and lost her, but he made use of her memory. He forged papers to appropriate her trust, convinced himself it was justified, for the church, for good causes. And when it began to unravel, when the blackmail came from Thomas, he resorted to worse. He covered one shame with another." Silence fell between them. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves on the walk. Wimsey stood. "I must speak to Willoughby now, not in a cell, not yet, but in the chapel. He's requested it." The chapel was cool, dimly lit and faintly musty with incense residue and old stone. Willoughby waited in the front pew, hands folded, the image of clerical serenity, spoiled only by the slight tremor in his fingertips. "You have it all, I presume," he said without looking up. "Yes," said Wimsey. "Even the letter you left anticipating your own failure. A romantic flourish, that." Willoughby gave a thin smile. "I was never meant for theatre." "No," said Wimsey, "but you performed well enough. Poison, forgery, misdirection, all very tidy. What I don't understand is the teaspoon." The vicar glanced up. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything." Willoughby sighed. "It was Edith's, bent slightly in the fire years ago. I kept it, a reminder that even silver warps in heat, that beauty isn't incorruptible. Whimsy nodded slowly. A philosophical spoon, then, though I dare say the jury won't appreciate the metaphor. Willoughby's smile faltered. You'll testify? I must. He looked away. Then that's the end of it. No, said Whimsy softly. It's the beginning. For Miss Armitage, for Thomas's sister, for those who will dig through the aftermath. But for you, it's the final verse. You wrote the refrain yourself. He turned to leave, footsteps echoing in the stone nave. Outside, the village lay quiet, unknowing, unchanged. Bunter waited by the path. All concluded, my lord? As much as anything ever is, said Whimsy, lighting a cigarette. The murder solved, the motive exposed, the teaspoon bent, the soul irreparably twisted. And with that, he walked on, the autumn wind tugging faintly at his coat, carrying with it the thin scent of withered apple leaves and something far more elusive, the fading trace of guilt, memory, and resolution. The drawing-room at Pallithorpe House was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun slanting through heavy drapes and casting long shadows over the assembled company. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the fireplace, his posture impeccably relaxed, the faintest trace of a sardonic smile playing about his lips. Around him, the household and a few of the village's notables, some curious, others apprehensive, had gathered at his behest. Inspector Pike was present, though he made no attempt to intrude upon the proceedings. He merely stood by the door, a silent sentinel to justice. Whimsy's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept across the faces before him. Thank you all for your attendance. I trust you will forgive the unorthodox nature of this meeting, but as you know, the mystery of the vicar's death is not one to be hurried or dismissed lightly. His voice, cool and measured, filled the room without ceremony. He paused briefly, extracting the slightly bent teaspoon from his pocket once more, holding it aloft with a theatrical flourish. This unassuming object, bent, as I have said, at a most peculiar angle, proved to be the fulcrum upon which this entire case has pivoted. A murmur rippled among the listeners, but none dared interrupt. Let us retrace the salient points, that all may appreciate the intricacy of human folly and the subtle machinery of deceit. He gestured to Inspector Pike, who produced a map of the village and the rectory grounds. The victim, Reverend Willoughby, was enmeshed in a web of his own weaving, embezzlement, forgery, and a desperate attempt to secure his position through means both moral and otherwise. Whimsy's gaze settled on Miss Armitage, seated quietly near the window, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Miss Armitage's testimony illuminated the vicar's dual existence, the man of faith and the man of secret passions and transgressions. Yet it was her unintended involvement in the poisoned cordial that initially misled the investigation. A tragic mistake born of affection, not malice. Turning to face the room, Whimsy raised a gloved finger. The crucial error, one that separated the murderer from the innocent, lay in the manipulation of time and alibi. Our victim was poisoned not by the cordial, but by a cunningly administered toxin concealed within the bite of an apple, served during the harvest supper. The eyes in the room widened in recognition. Now, who had access to the apples? Whimsy asked softly. A reluctant hand rose. Thomas, the vicar's beleaguered manservant. I prepared the fruit, sir. Indeed, but who else handled the apples? Particularly the one in question. Silence. Miss Armitage's presence in the kitchen was constant that evening, yet she denies administering any poison. Whimsy's eyes flicked toward her, as if weighing her truthfulness. And rightly so. Her intentions were benevolent, albeit tragically misplaced. He paced slowly, collecting his thoughts. The true perpetrator sought to silence Willoughby, not merely for blackmail, but to prevent discovery of a far graver secret. The diversion of the Brentwood Trust Fund. Forgery of documents and false accounts could have been exposed by an independent audit, one the vicar feared above all else. "But who, then?" demanded a voice from the back. Wimsey smiled thinly. "The one with the greatest opportunity, motive, and composure to enact such a deed without arousing suspicion." He turned to the butler, Mr. Pritchard, whose austere demeanour had barely faltered throughout the ordeal. The butler. A collective gasp. Mr. Pritchard was no mere observer, but the silent architect of the crime. His obsession with order, control, and the preservation of the house's reputation drove him to extremes. He manipulated the poisoned teaspoon, ensuring its subtle flaw was overlooked. He switched the fruit, administered the toxin, and meticulously constructed the alibi. Pritchard's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of defiance. Logic, circumstance, and witness statements align inexorably. The slight bend in the teaspoon, a detail so small it escaped the casual eye, corresponds with Pritchard's known habit of using that very piece as a wedge to hold open the kitchen door late at night. Wimsey paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The final inconsistency, the lock on the vestry door, though appearing intact, it was expertly manipulated to admit Pritchard at a critical moment when no one else should have entered. The butler straightened. "You accuse without proof, my lord." Wimsey's smile deepened. "On the contrary, the proof is here, and here alone." He held up a tiny scrap of paper, folded and tucked inside the spoon's curve. "A receipt from a chemist, dated the day before the supper, orders for a rare and deadly poison." The room held its breath. "Mr. Pritchard, you are under arrest for the murder of Reverend Willoughby." The butler's shoulders sagged for the first time, the veneer cracking under the relentless gaze of justice. "I did what I must. For the house, for order. Chaos breeds ruin." Wimsey's voice was gentle, almost pitying. "And yet chaos was precisely what you unleashed." The arrest was swift and silent. As Pritchard was led away, the assembled company seemed to exhale a breath they had been holding unconsciously. Wimsey turned to Miss Armitage. "You will find, madam, that the world is seldom kind to those who seek love where it cannot be returned, yet your truth has been indispensable." She nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing her lips. Finally, Wimsey faced Inspector Pike. "The matter is closed, then?" "Closed, my lord," the inspector agreed, a rare note of admiration in his tone. Wimsey tucked the bent teaspoon back into his pocket. "A curious thing, how the smallest imperfection reveals the greatest truths. One might say the spoon bent in fire was the measure of a man's soul." He glanced to the window, the sun now dipping behind the distant hills. "Let us hope that the peace which follows is more than just the absence of murder, but the quiet restoration of order, and perhaps a touch of grace." With that, Lord Peter Wimsey lifted his hat in a courteous bow, the faintest twinkle of mischief lingering in his eyes as he stepped into the cooling evening air, leaving behind a house restored in truth, if not innocence.